Moses spent 40 years surviving a scorching desert, only to be permanently banned from the finish line. Knowing he would die on the wrong side of the Jordan River, he had one final mission. He had to stop this new generation from repeating the catastrophic failures of their parents. The older Israelites had panicked, rebelled, and stubbornly wandered in endless circles until they died. To prevent another disaster, Moses delivered a sweeping farewell address, the Book of Deuteronomy. It literally means second law, a passionate repetition of God's rules to anchor their loyalty. But he didn't just recite rules. He presented a brutal life-or-death ultimatum. He set two literal paths before them. One was lined with lush, blooming fruits, the path of blessing. The other was a nightmare of sharp thorns and twisted vines, the path of curses and death. Moses urged them to choose life. Then he officially passed his heavy wooden staff to Joshua. With the covenant secured and a new leader installed, the mission would finally survive its founder. Moses climbed the towering peak of Mount Nebo for one final view of the Promised Land. He could never step foot inside, but as he gazed out over the horizon, Moses knew his lifelong mission was complete.
Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're here today because we're about to set the stage for a deep dive into one of the most foundational and honestly most fascinating texts in human history. We're talking about the Book of Deuteronomy. Now we are going to look at a text that brilliantly blends ancient history, intricate legal treaties, and a genuinely fascinating scholarly debate. Whether you're approaching this from a historical, literary, or theological perspective, there is just so much to uncover here. It is a literal masterpiece of ancient literature, and today we're going to break down exactly how it works.
Okay, let's dive right in. Right off the bat, we actually have a historical misunderstanding to clear up. You know the English title we use today, Deuteronomy? Well, it actually comes from the Greek word deuteronomion, which translates to second law, and that name was born out of a literal Greek mistranslation. If we look at the original Hebrew text, the book is called Devarim, which simply means words. It takes its name from the very first line of the scroll. These are the words. So it's not just some dry repetition of old laws, it's a living, breathing address.
So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll start on the edge of Canaan. Second, we'll look at ancient treaties and covenants. Third, the Shema and core themes. Fourth, the authorship mystery. And finally, we'll wrap up with the death of Moses.
All right, Section 1, on the edge of Canaan.
Our sources pinpoint the historical backdrop for this text to roughly 1406 BCE, out on the plains of Moab. Just imagine the scene for a second. The Israelites have just endured 40 grueling years of wandering in the wilderness. The entire generation that originally fled Egypt, they've passed away. Now, an aging Moses is standing before a brand new generation. They are camped just east of the Jordan River, literally staring at the Promised Land. But here's the dramatic tension. Moses himself has been barred by God from entering, so he's preparing the second generation to cross over without him. It's essentially his farewell address. You know, a father figure urgently preparing his people for a future he won't be part of.
Now, if you think the structure of Deuteronomy is just a random collection of rules, think again. It's actually composed of 3 overlapping speeches or sermons. Let's see how this builds. Step 1 is a historical look backward, where Moses reminds the people of their journey and God's faithfulness. Step 2 forms the massive core of the book, detailing the specific stipulations and laws of their covenant. And Step 3 is a powerful ceremony designed to memorialize this covenant, complete with blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. It is a highly organized, step-by-step masterclass in covenant loyalty.
Moving on to Section 2, ancient treaties and covenants.
And this brilliantly illustrates one of the most fascinating discoveries by modern scholars, like Meredith Kline. When we map out the structure of Deuteronomy, it mirrors almost exactly the secular political treaties of the great kings of that era, what historians call ancient Near Eastern suzerain vassal treaties. Basically, a powerful king, the suzerain, would make a treaty with a lesser king, the vassal, and it always followed a specific formula. It started with a preamble and a historical prologue of their relationship, followed by the stipulations or rules, and then it ended with blessings and curses. Deuteronomy takes this exact well-known legal framework of ancient politics and applies it directly to the relationship between God and Israel. It grounds this sacred text right in the legitimate, recognized legal formats of its day.
Diving a bit deeper into those ancient formats, there's a really fascinating linguistic detail our sources highlight regarding the curses section. Deuteronomy doesn't just, copy and paste from surrounding cultures. Instead, it playfully marries curses from the East Semitic world with native Northwest Semitic traditions. When it's outlining the severe consequences of breaking the covenant, the text uses familiar, localized stock images, like failing vineyards and ruined olive groves, couched in the syntax of maximum effort yielding minimal gain. It really shows a highly sophisticated, layered, and localized composition.
Okay, Section 3. The Shema and Core Themes.
I want to slow down for just a moment to emphasize this core verse. This is Deuteronomy 6:4, famously known as the Shema Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. This is arguably the most significant verse in the entire text. It's often described as the definitive statement of Jewish identity. I mean, it's a radical declaration of absolute loyalty in a world that was absolutely filled with polytheism. And its influence echoes through history. In the New Testament, Jesus himself quotes this very passage alongside the command to love God, identifying it as the Great Commandment.
So, the crucial takeaway is that Deuteronomy's themes revolve entirely around this covenantal relationship. The core themes include absolute monotheism, meaning worshiping God alone. It stresses covenant fidelity and loyalty, making it crystal clear that obedience isn't just some grim box-checking duty. It's an expression of a loving, personal relationship. It also mandates the centralization of worship to prevent idolatry from creeping in. And beautifully, it places a massive emphasis on social justice. It establishes strict protections for the poor, the widowed, and the disadvantaged. It's a comprehensive vision for a just society. And honestly, it still resonates deeply with modern legal and ethical frameworks today.
To put this into perspective, this book is so foundational that it acts as the theological lens for the rest of the Old Testament's historical books. Take Joshua and the Judges, for example. Joshua's ultimate success in the Promised Land is explicitly attributed to the fact that he meditated on this book of the law, meaning Deuteronomy, and obeyed it. But then, if you turn the page to the era of the Judges, it's a period of total, utter failure. And why? Because they ignored this law. The text notes that everyone did what was right in his own eyes, which just resulted in absolute chaos. Basically, Deuteronomy is the ultimate measuring stick for Israel's history.
Which brings us to Section 4, the authorship mystery.
So who actually wrote this thing? Well, there are two primary schools of thought here, and it's a pretty major debate. The traditional view, which has been held for centuries by Jewish and Christian thinkers, is that Moses authored the book himself on the plains of Moab around 1406 BCE. This is heavily based on internal claims within the text, where Moses is explicitly said to be writing down the law. But on the other side, virtually all modern secular scholars, and honestly many contemporary religious scholars too, point to a later date. They argue it was authored by a Levite or a specific Deuteronomist caste much later, between the 7th and 5th centuries BCE. They closely link its composition to the religious reforms of King Josiah. Both of these perspectives offer really fascinating insights into how the text has been preserved and understood over millennia.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, the death of Moses.
The final chapter, chapter 34, brings us up to the heights of Mount Nebo, to the peak of Pisgah, and it's an incredibly bittersweet moment. God invites Moses up to this high vantage point and shows him the entirety of the Promised Land. He sees from Gilead all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. He gets to see the absolute culmination of his life's work, the destination he spent 40 long years guiding his people toward. But because of a previous moment of disobedience, he is forbidden to actually cross over. His journey ends right there, on the mountain.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the logical conundrum it creates regarding the authorship we were just talking about. Think about it. If Moses wrote the whole book, how exactly do we handle chapter 34, which details his own death and the 30 days of mourning that followed? Some ancient thinkers, like Josephus, suggested Moses wrote it prophetically to prevent people from thinking he was immortal. However, it reads like straightforward history, not prophecy. Furthermore, it uses phrases like "to this day," which doesn't really sound like a man predicting his own demise. That's exactly why the Talmud tractate Baba Batha and many scholars today suggest that Moses' understudy, Joshua, was the one who added these final 8 verses, what scholars call post-messiacal comments, just to finish the record.
And that leaves us with one final, deeply evocative detail. The text states that God himself buried Moses in a valley in Moab, and that no one knows the location of his grave. Really think about that for a second. The greatest prophet of the era, the man who literally brought down the law, receives no monument, no shrine, no pilgrimage site. Why? Well, perhaps it was to prevent the Israelites from eventually worshiping at his tomb, reinforcing that core theme of absolute monotheism we discussed earlier. It leaves us pondering the enduring legacy of a leader whose final words shaped centuries of history, yet whose resting place remains a divine secret. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.
33 centuries ago, an entire nation set up camp on the dusty plains of Moab. After 40 years of wandering the desert, the Israelites finally stood on the edge of the Promised Land, separated from their goal only by the waters of the Jordan River. But a leadership crisis loomed over the camp. Moses, the prophet who had led them out of Egypt, had been forbidden by God from crossing the river. He was about to die, leaving his people at their most vulnerable moment. Knowing his time was short, Moses delivered a series of urgent farewell speeches. These addresses give the book its Greek title, Deuteronomian, or the Second Law. This wasn't a new set of rules. Instead, Moses was taking the original covenant established decades earlier and renewing it for a younger generation, one that had not personally witnessed the miracles of the Exodus. These speeches functioned as a high-stakes survival guide, designed to prepare a nation to step into hostile, unknown territory without its founding leader. The need for this renewal grew out of a history of failure. If the first covenant was already settled, why did Moses feel the need to repeat it so desperately? He points back to the memory of Mount Sinai. That is where their parents first received God's laws, only to immediately break them by worshiping a golden idol and refusing to trust the promises given to them. Moses reminded the crowd that while God had remained faithful through 40 years of wandering, the people themselves had been prone to drifting toward other gods the moment things became difficult. He argued that to break this multi-generational cycle of rebellion, it wouldn't be enough to just follow external rules. For the laws to actually stick, they had to move from the stone tablets into the very center of who the people were. This move toward internal devotion introduced a specific requirement. Deuteronomy is the first book in the biblical text to command believers to love God, adding a new dimension to their existing awe of his power. This command is found in the Shema, a prayer in chapter 6. It instructs the people to love God with every aspect of their being, their heart, their soul, and their physical strength. In the original Hebrew, the concepts of listening and loving are tightly linked. Moses taught that true obedience is an active response to the grace God had already shown them during their journey. This prayer became a central anchor of daily life. Families began writing these words on scrolls and attaching them to their doorposts, creating a constant physical reminder to keep the covenant. The long list of statutes that follow in the text provide the framework for this exclusive monotheistic relationship, turning the abstract idea of love into specific daily actions. As Moses reached the climax of his style sermons, he structured the covenant as a formal treaty, complete with specific conditions and heavy consequences. This structure mirrored ancient vassal treaties, using strict if-then logic to enforce loyalty. On one path, obedience led to agricultural success, peace, and security. On the other, rebellion triggered devastating outcomes, including military defeat, famine, and exile from the Promised Land. Facing the massive crowd on the plains, Moses issued his final ultimatum. He laid out the two paths and gave a simple command: choose life. Israel would only remain in the land as long as they stayed loyal to the covenant. Their future rested entirely on their daily choices. With the sermons finished and the choice presented, Moses began the formal transfer of power. He installed Joshua as the new leader of Israel. Joshua was the one charged with leading the military conquest that Moses would never see. In his final act, Moses wrote down the Book of the Law and entrusted it to the priests. This ensured that even without his presence, the nation had a permanent, written witness to the agreement they had made. By securing both a successor and a written text, Moses insulated the nation's future against the loss of its greatest leader. His work complete, Moses climbed the heights of Mount Nebo alone to face his end. At the summit, God showed Moses the full panoramic expanse of the Promised Land, the same land he had promised to Abraham centuries earlier. The book ends with a final mystery. God buried Moses in an undisclosed valley. By keeping the grave's location a secret, the text ensured that the site could never become an object of idolatry. Deuteronomy leaves its readers positioned on those same plains of Moab, reminded of their history, and asked to choose their path.